This is Christy, and we have merchandise. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com and check out amazing t-shirts, mugs, stickers. If you love great quotes, we have some of our favorites. If you love silliness, check out our mascot, Brain Man. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com, click on the shop button, and find something for that person who needs to be reminded that we are fashioned creatures but half made up. Mary Shelley said that.
With the Redfin app, you'll know the moment your next place hits the market. Whether you're looking to buy your dream home or rent a sweet apartment, give Redfin your gotta-have-it wish list of property features, and you'll receive real-time notifications tailored just for you. Ready to see it up close and personal? Scheduling a tour is just a tap away. Don't wait to find your perfect match. Download the Redfin app and start searching today.
Did you know 1 in 2 women wear the wrong foundation? Matching foundation is hard, but Il Maquillage makes it easy. Take the Power Match quiz to find a perfect match in seconds, customized to your unique skin tone, undertone, and coverage needs. With 600,000 5-star reviews, Woke Up Like This is our best-selling foundation for a reason. Available in 50 shades of weightless natural coverage. And with Try Before You Buy, you can try your full size at home for 14 days. Just pay shipping. Take the quiz at ilmaquillage.com/quiz. That's ILMAKIAGE.com/quiz.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hi, I'm Christy Schreiber, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Schreiber, and this is the How to Level It podcast. And today we turn our attention to Europe, first to Germany, but then to Switzerland, to meet Nobel Prize winner Herman Hesse and explore his lyrical novel, Siddhartha. His works were all written in German, but Siddhartha in particular, even though it was completed in 1922, was only translated into English in 1951. It found success in the English-speaking world during the 1960s and the 1970s, in great part due to its association with the countercultural student movement that characterized that time period, not just in the United States, but all over the Western world. It achieved cult status at Woodstock, and it joined the ranks of books like On the Road by Jack Kerouac and The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And it helped define that counterculture political moment that today we see in movies like Forrest Gump, and we think of as being about hippies protesting the Vietnam War, but really it was much larger than one single political or social issue.
Right, and in some ways, the fact that people associate this book with any political time period is ironic when we consider the person of Herman Hesse and what he stood for during his life. I mean, if Hesse were alive today, I think he would be glad that his work is associated with nonviolence. But I think he probably would be surprised that it's associated with any political season in the minds of people. I mean, he went to such great lengths to emphatically avoid political involvement. He was disillusioned by violence. And of course, it's understandable when we think that one of his wives was Jewish and that he lived through World War I and then World War II, and he was German. Hesse was curious about man's soul. That's a Christian term, which he doesn't use. But regardless of that, Siddhartha is a spiritual book. I mean, it's about the journey of the individual into yourself. It's about searching for one's place in the world, but certainly not through politics or economics or anything in society. It's about finding inner peace and happiness from inside, not outside. It's about asking and answering the basic question of how to find ultimate peace and happiness independent of materialism at all.
Oh, well, that's a big order. Does he answer the question in a way that's satisfactory?
Well, do authors ever answer their own questions? Let's say that he explores the question. I mean, he certainly looks at it differently than most authors in the West have looked at it, and he tries to defamiliarize his audience enough with their cultural context that they may be open to thinking about things differently themselves. I mean, one way he does this is by setting the book far away in a land unfamiliar to most of his readers. It's set in 6th century in Kapuvatsu, which today is Nepal. But even that is vaguely defined, and really where it's set isn't all that important. The story opens like this, quote, "In the shade of the house, in the sunlight on the riverbank near the boats, in the shade of the sal tree forest, in the shade of the banyan fig, Siddhartha grew up, the handsome son of the Brahman, the young falcon, together with Govinda, his friend, the son of a Brahman." You know, that's a long, almost dreamy sentence. I mean, it's full of descriptive, parallel prepositional phrases, and it kind of highlights, light and darkness, the natural world. But most interesting, maybe, is the fact that it mentions 2 young men at the highest level of Hindu society. They're Brahmin. That's our setting. But Brahmin, just that word, that might need a little bit of explanation.
Sure. Well, when we talk about Brahmins, we're talking about the caste system in India. It's the social hierarchy that still exists today. But of course, the story isn't talking about today. We're talking about the 6th century. But this classification system is older even than that. And the caste system created divisions of labor based on birthright. And the Brahmins were and still are the most powerful caste in the Indian society. And today they can be any profession, but in those days they were priests and spiritual and intellectual leaders. They devoted their time to studying and teaching and performing sacrifices and officiating religious ceremonies. And of course, that's what we see these 2 characters doing in the start of the book. They're studying. They understand how to speak the Om, which is the most important Hindu symbol, and it represents the sound of creation. And it's 3 syllables, and it symbolizes many sacred trinities, and is chanted or meditated on to achieve spiritual awareness.
So he's taking us to a place of the unfamiliar, but he's not taking us into a fairy world. I mean, we're not going into a galaxy far, far away. We don't see the language of once upon a time. So it's not that kind of a setting. He's introducing us to an ancient culture that actually exists. And he's teaching us words that we may not know, like Brahman or and Atman. But these are actual concepts. And we don't have really good words for these ideas in the West. In fact, one of the nice things about this book, it helps us formulate an understanding of terms that we may have heard out there, but we really didn't conceptualize or understand well.
Well, let's also not overlook the title of the book, which is also the name of the protagonist of the story. And Siddhartha is a common Indian male name, but it means one who has attained his goal. It's a famous name because it's the name of the person most of us in the West think of being the Buddha. The Buddha that most of us think of when we hear that word is Siddhartha Gautama. While our Siddhartha is a made-up character, Siddhartha Gautama is a prince of the Shakya nation of ancient India. And his father, King Shuddhana, named his son Siddhartha. This historical Prince Siddhartha became Shakyamuni Buddha, and Shakyamuni is his title and means the sage of Shakya. So that's how he's referenced. So Shakyamuni Buddha and Gautama Buddha are the same person. One is just a title, and the other is his family name. But of course, most of us just know the name Buddha, and the reason why most of us have heard this name is because Shakyamuni Buddha founded Buddhism. So to your point, although his character is fiction, there is a sense in that the religious traditions are being exposed to, and key important religious figures in the book are real, even if I mispronounce their names.
Well, I want to clarify that Shakyamuni Buddha is also a character in our story, but he's not the main character. These two men share the same name, Siddhartha. They're both called Siddhartha, but one is real, Shakyamuni or Gautama Buddha, and the other one is fictional. And that's the context of the story. It seems, confusing when I say it that way, but in the story, it's really not. So having said that, placing our Siddhartha, as in the character, living at the same time as Shakyamuni Buddha dates the story. There's no specific date anywhere in the story, but we know that because they had to take place during the lifetime of Gautama Buddha, that they were at a particular place. So we can situate the story in somewhat of a historical setting. Our Siddhartha, the character, is one generation younger than Shakyamuni Buddha, who he'll meet in the story.
Okay, so that simplifies it. So we got that. All right, well, the story starts with the traditional conflict between the Brahmanical and Buddhist way. In other words, we see a contrast right in the beginning between what the Hindus believe and what the Buddhists believe.
Yes, and that is something those of us without a background in Eastern religions may know very little about. And maybe we wouldn't even have caught that here at the beginning of the story. Honestly, though, the more we know about the religious context, the more we can get out of it. But knowledge of Hinduism and Buddhism isn't necessary if you want to enjoy the story or even understand what Hesse is trying to show us through the allegory. We don't need to know what a Brahman is to understand that Siddhartha is giving a lot up when he leaves home, and he's leaving because he's frustrated. We can still understand that our character Siddhartha has been raised in a religious household, that he devoutly practices his religion. We can understand that he understands well the tenets of his religion. May I quote Hesse here? The interior of his being, he recognized Atman, indestructible, at one with the universe. The story goes on to say that, quote, his father's heart skipped joyously for this son who was quick to learn, thirsty for knowledge. In him he saw growing a great sage and priest, a prince among the Brahmins. So the Siddhartha of our story is a perfect child. It goes on to say that his mother's breast flutters every time she sees her son sit down or stand up because he's so strong and so handsome. All the girls in town are stirred to love when they see Siddhartha walk down the street because he has a radiant brow and he has the eye of a king and narrow hips. So Siddhartha is obviously attracting lots of attention from girls, from boys, from the adults in the community. He's doing well.
He is. This is the story about a rich, dutiful, beautiful, perfect child who has everything, but he doesn't even exploit his privilege. And he's the rare child who has everything and somehow manages not to become an entitled brat. He is the opposite of a Nepo baby, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so.
So he's described as magnificent Siddhartha, and it is said he brings delight to everyone, and yet something seems to be missing.
Yes, the text says very directly that Siddhartha did not delight himself. He was no pleasure to himself. It says his own heart did not bear him joy, and he suffered from turbulent thoughts. He had a restlessness of soul. He nourished discontentment. And in that way, Hesse makes Siddhartha a little bit like himself. The story Siddhartha, in many ways, is Hesse's autobiographical tale of self-discovery, even though on the surface, Hesse and Siddhartha are nothing alike. Hesse is not Indian. He's not Hindu. He's not royalty. He doesn't live in the 6th century. They're not even the same personality-wise. He certainly was not a pleasure to everyone. On the contrary, Hesse got into a lot of trouble when he was a kid. So if all those things are true, the question is, in what way is Siddhartha's story Hesse's story? Who is Herman Hesse, and how did a German expatriate from the early 20th century come to write a book about 6th century India that has become an American phenomenon in the 1960s?
Well, first, he's a Protestant German missionary kid born in the town of Calf at the edge of the Black Forest on July 2nd, 1877. His grandfather on his father's side was a doctor and a politician. His grandfather, Herman Gundert, on his mother's side was a missionary and an Indologist. And Herman Gundert spent 20 years as a Christian missionary in India. Then he returned to Europe to direct a publishing house. He was fluent in English, German, French, Italian, Hindustani, Malayalam, Bengali, Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil.
That tires me out.
I know. I have a hard time with one language. He was also familiar, although not fluent, in at least 10 other languages. So, bottom line, he was brilliant. He translated the Bible into Malayalam as well as wrote a Malayalam grammar. His home in Calf, which was filled with artifacts and souvenirs from Southeast Asia, left an extremely strong impression on young Herman Hesse. It was beautiful and exotic, and there were always missionaries and scholars, and they were all talking about India. His grandfather had a huge library of Indian texts and art pieces and all kinds of artifacts from India, and we can only imagine how mesmerizing it would be for a young mind naturally to be inclined to this sort of thing.
Well, beyond that, I mean, Hesse's parents were also missionaries to India, but his father couldn't stay there because of health issues. So they lived in Calf, where Johannes, Herman Hesse's father, became the director of the Basel Mission Society. And his mother was a writer. She wrote biographies. One was the biography of the famous missionary David Livingstone. I mean, she was like her dad in that she was a polyglot, although she only spoke 4, maybe 5.
What a slacker.
I know. But so you can see, from this short description that the first parallel between the Siddhartha from the story and Herman Hesse, and that they were both raised in very orthodox religious homes. And there is a sense that you could say that Herman Hesse was, religious royalty in his little community. I mean, the religions obviously are different, but the expectations of orthodoxy were both very present. Hesse, like Siddhartha, had trouble adapting to this. Of course, while Siddhartha's struggles are mostly internal, but on the outside, he's doing everything perfectly, that was not our young Herman Hesse's story. I mean, Hesse couldn't make himself conform, even when he tried. And it does seem like he tried to conform. He was just one of those kids who was naturally restless and nonconforming. He couldn't settle into the expectations of his community to the point that his educational life basically consisted of him getting kicked out of one school after another for what was termed, quote, bad behavior. I mean, at one point, we can see his father writing, and he's saying, and let me just quote his dad, "Humiliating though it would be to us, I am nevertheless seriously wondering if we should not put him into an institution or farm him out to strangers. We're too nervous and too weak for him. He seems to have a gift for everything. He observes the moon and the clouds, and he improvises on the harmonium, and he makes quite amazing pencil and pen drawing, still very able when he has a mind to, and he is never at a loss for rhymes."
Well, that's a very generous explanation for constantly getting in trouble. But it does highlight that he's got all this talent and mental energy, but he can't harness it and stay out of trouble.
Correct. And perhaps, thankfully, even though he had little interest in school and did get in trouble, he still managed to always be at the top of his class in terms of grades. I mean, he even passed the exams to attend the very exclusive Malbron Monastery School. And that's a very prestigious school that still exists today, but dates back to the 1500s. Although a monastery school, I mean, you can tell from the word, probably wasn't the best. Well, it wasn't a good fit for him at all. I mean, the school was strict, and he ran away at one point for 23 hours. I mean, he was miserable there. He suffered extreme headaches. He had insomnia. At one point, he was sent to live with a minister, and within a month, he had literally purchased a revolver and written a suicide note. So he's defiant, depressed to the point that he got himself sent to a school for the emotionally disturbed.
And I would like to point out all of this is going on, and he's only 15 years old.
I know, which is one part of the problem, right? I mean, he's 15. It's natural for a young boy at 15 to question his roots. But Hesse's family was very strict. They followed this form of Protestantism called pietism. And this religious tradition emphasized holy living to the point that he just couldn't live up to those standards. And he railed against the religion completely. Gary, a lot of us have never heard of that word, pietism. Can you explain a little bit about what is that? What, part of Christianity is that?
Sure, yeah. Well, as a movement, it was different than the traditional Lutheran church in that it emphasized how you live really over doctrine and theology. And it spread quickly and was very interested in social movements and education. So you can think of it as a practical application of Protestant theology. And John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist Church, was very inspired by it and emphasized a lot of its ideas when he developed the role of the Methodist Church, which originally had a very strong focus on social movements. And in fact, the entire evangelical Protestant movement in the United States and across the world, honestly, has roots in this tradition of outwardly applying Christian principles to how you live your life.
Well, I don't really know how this was applied in Hesse's home, but what we do know is that Hesse became angry with his father, with the establishment, with his faith, and eventually his father allowed him to withdraw completely from all formal education. He became an apprentice machinist in a tower clock factory where he confined himself to difficult manual labor for almost a year. And from there, he didn't go back to formal school. Instead, he took another apprenticeship at a bookstore, which was the change. Well, and it was a good fit for him.
It certainly was easier physically, but really it was a perfect fit for him because even though he could not adapt to the disciplines of German schools, he did love learning, and now he had access, and he began to read and read and read. And in his words, he said, "It's the work I do on my own that makes life worthwhile." He read everything, but his favorite author was Goethe, and he learned to love reading, but he also learned to love writing outside of the strict German school system. Ironically, he found success as a writer, too, which in many ways was very German. I mean, historically, self-education has deep roots in Germany, and, great German thinkers like Luther and Goethe and Kant and many others were important advocates of self-education. So it's not surprising that the more he read these men, the more he took on these characteristics. In 1899, Hesse published first a small collection of poems, but then a prose collection. And then he married a woman named Maria and had a son named Bruno, and they built a home. They cultivated a garden, and by 1904, he won a literary award, and he was on his way to professional success, and for a while, on his way to better mental health. By 1911, he'd had 3 children, and he was an established writer.
Yes, but by 1911, he is still restless, just like Siddhartha in the story. So Hesse went to India. Well, actually, Southeast Asia. I mean, he traveled to Malaya, Sumatra, Ceylon. I mean, he'd always been fascinated with it. His mother had been born there. His father and grandfather had been missionaries there. He'd heard stories. And yet, his reaction to what he found in India was mixed. I mean, in some ways, it didn't live up to, this romanticized vision of what he thought he would find there. And in some ways, he came back, with an understanding that India, for him, had been more of an idea than even an actual place.
I want to read something Hesse wrote about India a little later in 1920. He said this: "My preoccupation with India, which has been going on for almost 20 years and has passed through many stages, now seems to me to have reached a new point of development. Previously, my reading, searching, and sympathies were restricted exclusively to the philosophical aspect of India, the purely intellectual, Vedantic and Buddhistic aspect. The Upanishads, the sayings of Buddha, and the Bhagavad Gita were the focal point of this world. Only recently have I been approaching the actual religious India of the gods of Vishnu and Indra and Brahma and Krishna. And now Buddhism appears to me more and more as a kind of very pure, highly bred reformation, a purification and spiritualization that has no flaw but its great zealousness with which it destroys image worlds for which it can offer no replacement.
And so he said that 10 years later. I mean, that's even after he wrote Siddhartha. But what do you think he means?
Well, to me, it shows what it shows is this humble pursuit of truth that really was what Hesse was after. And I want to point out that Hesse never converted to Hinduism. He was never a Buddhist, and he never totally abandoned his Christian roots. He said for the rest of his life that his parents' Christianity as a faith was not just preached, but lived, and that was the strongest power that shaped and molded him. And what Hesse seems to be an advocate of, above all else, is this personal ability to absorb an array of ideas into oneself. And this little book really is a mixture of all those three worldviews.
Right. And I think that is kind of a misconception that people have. I think a lot of people go into the reading of this book and they think they're studying Buddhism. In fact, I've read a few critics that say that the first 4 chapters of Siddhartha are about the 4 noble truths and the last 8 chapters are about the eightfold path of Buddha. And even though, those numbers work out as chapter numbers pretty well, I think most people would say that's a misreading of the text. I mean, Hesse is not trying to convert us to Buddhism or Hinduism. He's not even trying to teach us about the specific distinctions of each of these religious traditions. He blends them a little here. And for those of us, it can be confusing if we're not familiar with these traditions. Sometimes we don't know if he's talking about Hinduism or if he's talking about Buddhism. And in some ways, well, in a lot of ways, Hinduism and Buddhism have polar opposite ways of looking at the world. It's important to understand that Hesse is not trying to convert anyone to anything, because if you read this book for an explanation of Eastern religions, it may spoil your experience. You don't need to sort out any particular thing that you should be believing or not believing. This story is best read as a story of self-discovery, written within the framework of an Eastern tradition, but not necessarily an apologetic text attempting to persuade us to pursue any one religious dogma. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, so basically you're saying he's not trying to convert anybody to a different religion if they have one.
Exactly. And in some ways, although the title of the book is named after the founder of Buddhism, the story itself could be interpreted as kind of a rebellious text against the Buddhist way, and we'll see that a little bit in later episodes. Hesse, from the beginning to the end of the book, is advocating individualism. And that's where we start in this beginning section of the story. And it's what we see parallel in Hesse's personal life. Hesse felt the need to leave his family's tradition, his family's way of thinking, and just figure things out for himself. And that's what Siddhartha, the story, is basically about. In Hesse's case, after returning from India, he realized that his marriage was in trouble. I mean, his wife wanted their children to have Swiss nationality, so in 1912, Hesse, his wife, and their 3 kids moved from Germany to Bern, Switzerland, and that was 2 years, by the way, pay attention to the dates, before the outbreak of World War I.
Which is another misconception. Lots of people think Hesse fled Germany because of the war, but that was not the case. And at first he did try to support his home country by supporting the war effort. And he went to the German consulate and he volunteered to serve. He was rejected at first, but eventually was assigned to work in a prisoners of war welfare organization, which he did tirelessly. He provided books and other support to prisoners to the point that he actually exhausted himself. However, even though he supported his country, he didn't support the causes of the war. And he saw it as a result of materialism, and he was totally devoted to the ideas of peace and spirituality and individualism, and couldn't really define himself as either a liberal or a conservative. And this kind of posturing did not sit well with the German press. And he was moderately well known at this point, and he was called in the papers a traitor and a wretch. And many of his former friends turned on him for standing up to the war psychosis as he saw it. And he was very hurt by these accusations, and World War I itself caused him extreme distress. And at this very time, his son got extremely sick. His father died. His wife was diagnosed with mental issues and was put into a mental institution. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, that's a rough patch. And it sent him spiraling. I mean, he had to leave Bern. His kids were sent to live with another family, and he moved north to a tiny village in northern Switzerland. And every bit of this made him re-examine everything that he had built his life upon up to that point. I mean, he began to doubt things he'd considered fundamental truths, including religion and education and everything that he had practiced in the West. And none of what we had done in the West had kept the West from plunging headfirst into a murderous war. And he could not understand where the truth in all of that was. So the story of Siddhartha is his attempt to restore his faith, his peace of mind, his relationship with the world. He wanted a different spiritual orientation because he absolutely did not believe anymore at that point in the goodness of man. He wanted a new concept of God, but one that didn't just see God in nature. I mean, a few of the words in the Bible that resonated strongly with him was when Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you." And he wanted to reestablish some kind of faith. He wanted to combine the teachings of Jesus with things that he had heard from Buddha and those from the sacred texts of India.
Well, Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism has significant disagreements, really starting with the concept of God. And Christianity believes that there is only one God, and Hinduism believes there are millions of gods, and Buddhism doesn't even have a supreme God or deity.
Yes, those are big differences. And as a result, Siddhartha, the novel, falls into the literary tradition of what we call a coming-of-age story, or to use the German word that's now an English word, a Bildungsroman. I mean, it's about evolving. And you think of this as a spiritual Huck Finn or a spiritual Emma. I mean, the story is going to trace a man's character, well, the character's path towards self-realization, just like Huck Finn or Emma does, but it's completely different. I mean, the term that critics use to describe this book is the via mystica, or it's a mystical way.
Can I point out something? Are you the first person ever to connect Herman Hesse to Mark Twain?
No, I am not. It's been done before.
Okay.
But it's only in that one way. You know, Hesse in this little book navigates differences and even similarities between three very different religions. We're going to start with Hinduism, like we have on the first page of Siddhartha. Let me quote the text again. Already he understood within the interior of his being that he recognized Atman, indestructible, at one with the universe. This concept of Atman, although definitely not a Christian concept, in some ways, if you have a Western background, you can understand it as kind of the concept of the soul.
True. And Christians believe that God breathes life into humans and we possess a soul, something that will live forever, long after the body has returned to the earth. And Hindus believe man has a soul, but the difference is Hindus believe man's soul is eternal, both moving forward and backwards, meaning man's soul existed before his body and will exist after his body. I know it feels a little confusing. The essence that Hesse brings out is this idea that there is something beyond the material, which in the West is not always commonly accepted.
And that's the starting point of the book. I mean, there's something non-material inside of us. And that non-material part of Hesse was what he found to be restless. What do we do with that? That's the beginning question. He starts with these two Hindu concepts, Atman and Brahman. Atman is the center of self, but Brahman is the infinite circumference of all the created universe. So our starting point in this book is really a paradox. There's an internal reality, Atman, and there's an external reality, Brahman. The Atman is the immutable consciousness of the individual. The Brahman is the all-pervading consciousness of the universe. Was that enough to make your head explode?
I think you English people call that a paradox.
Yes.
You know, things that don't appear to make any sense, but kind of do if you think about them long enough.
Exactly. And what this story is about is watching this character, Siddhartha, travel in both directions. He's going to explore the interior regions of the spirit, but then he's going to explore the exterior expanse of the world before settling in the end to a place where Hesse argues these two realms touch. And the word that he uses is enlightenment. Siddhartha will meet 4 important people. They mark his life. He will detach in 3 different stages. But finally, he's going to arrive at a synthesis of contemplation.
So not only does that sound complicated, was that also a plot spoiler?
Well, this is not a mystery novel. I mean, yes, kind of. There are things that happen for sure that I did not spoil. But you're not going to read Siddhartha for thrilling, plot twists. I mean, think of it as the scholar Robert Thurman describes it in the introduction to the English version. He says Siddhartha is a prose poem of lived philosophy. I think of it in terms of rhetoric, I guess. There's this great rhetorician, Peter Elbow, and he has what he calls the believing game.
Well, there's a crossover. And for those of you who might not know Peter Elbow, the famous professor emeritus from the University of Massachusetts, but he's a writer and a leader in the field of rhetoric. And Christy, explain how you think this book should be read playing the believing game.
Right. Well, Elbow teaches us that here in the West, we pride ourselves because we consider ourselves to be critical thinkers. We question everything. We feel that we should be skeptical about new ideas. And this really is one way to arrive at truth. But Elbow says that even though there's value to critical thinking, it is not the only way we should approach unfamiliar ideas. He says when we approach things critically, we're playing the doubting game. However, he says we shouldn't only play the doubting game. We have to match the doubting game with what he calls the believing game. And Siddhartha is about learning to play the believing game. When you think you're critical, by definition, that means you're dogmatic about your own way of thinking. And Elbow would tell you that traps you into a position. You're defensive. Why not, for the sake of finding truth, drop that defensive posture and just assume that everything or something that you have never believed and never even considered and don't see how it could possibly be true, consider and think and believe that it actually is true. Elbow says you should dwell in it. Assume, just for the sake of argument, that your own mind needs changing. Now, doing this is a very scary thing to ask yourself to do or to ask someone else to do because we believe things for specific reasons. We believe things because it helps us become members of a community, and our community believes certain things. And our world rests on certain things that we believe are true, and to doubt certain things threatens us. It threatens our relationships, our worldview, everything that we understand about the world. But Elbow argues and I agree with him, that it's a brave thing to do, and we should do it. Let go of an idea, even temporarily. Take on a different idea. This is not natural. Our minds aren't good at this. Elbow gives us the analogy of a muscle. You can tell your muscle to let go. Your mind can do that, but it's hard. You can try to get a muscle to relax, and maybe that's one way of letting go. But really, the only way to get one muscle to let go is to let a different muscle tense up. And when you let a different muscle tense up, the other muscle will just naturally let go. That works. Elbow says that that's the way we should approach ideas. We need to get out of one idea so that we can then look back at that same idea from the outside to see what you believe from the perspective of another. Sometimes, and this is what Hesse is doing in the book, we need to stop looking at things from an either-or perspective. We don't have to be critical or dogmatic on an opposite point of view. We should just travel into the idea. And that is the journey of Siddhartha. As we begin the story, we're going to see Siddhartha leave what is comfortable, where he's successful, where he's loved and admired, and he is going to try on new ideas. He'll visit a very strict environment of a group called the Samanas. He'll visit the Gautama Buddha. He will spend years with a courtesan named Kamala, and he's going to live what Hesse calls with child people. But then he will cross over the river and find his own identity.
This does sound very philosophically challenging, and I can understand why they loved this stuff in the 60s, okay? But, it kind of reminds me of the first phrase out of the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus in the Christian New Testament, where he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Except Hesse isn't really taking you to any particular definition of what the kingdom of heaven really is.
Right. And I think that's exactly it. I mean, if you define poor of spirit, what are you talking about? Being humble, being in need of something that materialism can't offer, and being willing to play the believing game. It's what Jesus is saying to the people he's talking to. I mean, this is a large crowd of people who are believing all sorts of things. I know most of them were Jewish, but likely not all. And he's saying, if you seek heaven with humility, play the believing game, to use Elbow's words, and you will find the kingdom of heaven. It was Hesse's journey. It was his personal journey, and it is the journey he takes us on by way of this character, Siddhartha. This is a story of a Western man's search for the kingdom of heaven, and his search starts in this story in the East.
And so we begin Siddhartha. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the life of Herman Hesse and his timeless novella, Siddhartha. Next episode, we discuss more of his philosophy and the first section of the book in full. Between now and then, thank you for listening. Hopefully we gave you some food for thought. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider forwarding it to a friend, sharing it on social media, or reaching out to us with a positive review or comment. It's when you share that we grow. Thank you for supporting our mission of making the discussion and study of literature as accessible to as many people as possible.
Peace out.
Hey, you know what would make your customer service help desk way better? Dumping it and then switching to Intercom. But you're not quite ready to make that change. We get it. That's why Finn, the world's leading AI customer service agent, is now available on every help desk. Finn can instantly resolve up to 80% of your tickets, which makes your customers happier and gets you off the customer service rep hiring treadmill. Finn by Intercom, the leading customer service AI agent, now available on every help desk.
If you're looking for flexible workouts, Peloton's got you covered. Summer runs or playoff season meditations. Whatever your vibe, Peloton has thousands of classes built to push you. We know how life goes. New father, new routines, new locations. What matters is that you have something there to adapt with you, whether you need a challenge or rest. And Peloton has everything you need whenever you need it. Find your push. Find your power. Peloton. Visit onepeloton.com.
Hi, this is Freddie Wong from Dungeons and Daddies, and this episode is sponsored by Rocket Money.
Houston.
Blast off. Houston, we have a problem, and that's too many subscriptions that I don't know about because I like to put my credit card number into sites.
Just for the sheer thrill of it.
That's the fundamental problem of the internet and money, and Rocket Money is here to solve that. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills. You can see all those subscriptions that you've accrued over a lifetime of putting your credit card in on the internet in one place. And if you don't want them, just cancel them. With a few taps, Rocket Money can help with that. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/cancel subs. That's rocketmoney.com/cancel subs, not submarines.